Greetings! In this video, we will discuss UV mapping, which is the process of taking our three-dimensional object and laying it out flat for the purposes of texture making, painting textures or copying and pasting textures. And if we look out here, here's our three-dimensional object, and we have laid these pieces out flat, which allow us to create that texture. The process is analogous to pattern making in fashion design. Just in reverse. If you take a look here, there's a piece of dark gray material laid out flat. Pattern are placed, traced, cut out, and then stitched together to form the three-dimensional object. In this case, it looks like a blazer. So you can see here's the front right panel of the blazer. This looks like it might be the rear of the coat. Maybe this is the lapel, right? So that material is completely flat. It is two-dimensional. It is cut, the pieces are two-dimensional, and then it becomes three-dimensional when they're stitched together. We're going in reverse order. We have our three-dimensional object here, and we're going to lay it out flat. We'll be using a set of just 4 tools here in the UV toolkit, and I'll review those in just a moment. Let's first of all, we're going to hide our joints. Right? We're going to delete our history. We're going to come to Edit, and there's nothing else in my scene. Let's just review. I've got my single bit of geometry here. I have just a single piece, and I've got a rather long set of joint chains, but those are the only 2 things in my scene. So I can come to Edit, Delete All by Type History. If you had other things in the scene with history, you'd want to have this selected and say Delete by Type History. Note also we haven't smoothed it. We're still in the first subdivision. We're still in the box model phase. We can, once we're done with the UV, right, if I come up here and we say Smooth, you see how the UV automatically doubled. So it automatically subdivided. We wouldn't want to subdivide it or smooth it first and then try to work here in the UV because it's giving us much more work. We have more edges to keep track of, more UVs to keep track of. So you always want to create your UV map from your most primitive model before any smoothing or subdividing is done. So we model. In this case, we've created the skeleton as we've gone along just to make sure everything fit together well. But we haven't bound in this case because we want to smooth before we bind, and we want to UV map before we smooth. So we've created the box model, our primitive model, and before we smooth it, to bind it, we're going to create the UV map. Let's talk about the basic tools that we'll be using. And let's talk about some basic language. So this is a shell. Each of these pieces is considered a shell. So we can see here is the eye. If I were to right click out here, it would be right clicking UV shell. And we can see that this corresponds with this piece. And one of the overriding strategies is when we cut, we want to put the intersections in the least conspicuous place. So if we look here, the front of the head wraps all the way around. And we have that intersection between these 2 shells in a place where people aren't really probably going to notice it. Now again, this is all predicated on storyboard, just a little advertisement for why storyboarding is so important. If you know the camera angle, then you know where you want to put your seams. Right? You know what is least conspicuous. If this were some type of model and we were looking up at it all the time, then we'd really want to make an effort to have a seamless underside. If we're imagining, right, that we're going to be looking kind of mostly at this character from these angles, right, we're not going to be underneath it, then this map that's laid out here is probably the ideal map. And as I lay out the UV map for us today, I'll take a slightly different approach than this one here, although I think just by default or generically speaking, this is probably the most versatile map that we can create. The one downside is having the legs with double seams. I'll create a version of this today that just has a single seam so you can see the difference. In terms of our tools, I'm here in the UV Toolkit, UV Editor, and that comes up with our toolkit. And we're going to be using, as I mentioned, 4 main tools. Under Cut and Sew is cut, and then we'll be using stitch together. So we'll be cutting edges and stitching those shells that get created. We'll be stitching those together. We'll be using the unfold tool, right? So when we cut apart the shell and then we want to lay it flat, the unfold tool will be our go-to tool. Now we're going to be using the plugin Unfold, and we don't have a dialog box here. The long way to find Unfold is to come to Modify, all the way towards the bottom. Unfold will open that dialog box, and we're using the third-party plugin Unfold 3D. The old Maya legacy does not produce an algorithmic, does not produce a result algorithmically on par with Unfold 3D. Much better process. But sometimes the plugins don't load. So if your Unfold 3D isn't available to you there, again, I went to Modify, Unfold, open the dialog box. If yours says Unfold 3D, you're in business, you don't have to do anything. But let's say, imagine that it wasn't there. In that case, you'd come to Windows, Settings Preferences, Plugin Manager, and from the top, it's at the end of the first long list. And so there is Unfold 3D. I can see that it's loaded. Both of these are checked. If it wasn't, you'd want to select both of those and hit refresh, and then you'd see that it was available to you. You might have to reopen it in order to be able to select it. That is, in the event that it wasn't loaded properly. So cut edges, we will stitch together edges, we will unfold shells, and then we'll also have to come up here to the transform, and at the bottom of that long list of transform tools is flip. And we'll need to use, or we'll need to be able to flip the U and the V. Just a quick example on this wing, if we are to look at this, right, if I flip on the U, it's flipping back and forth and then up and down. I'm gonna undo that. And if you've seen some of my other introductions to UV mapping, you know that our primary goal is to have no overlap. And so that might seem a little funny because I've got these wings overlapping actually. But in this case for the wing, our model is paper thin and we want to project the same map through. So there are instances when you want to project a map that fits on both sides. The wings in this instance are an example of that. But as it, for everything else, there is no overlap. If we were to zoom in here and look at the UVs, right, you can see that there is no overlap. And ultimately at the core, what UV mapping or unfolding is doing, and you'll see the phrase no overlapping UVs when it comes to someone showcasing their texture making. All they've done is, right, when they first laid it out, you can see here that this would be considered overlapping UVs. There's no way that I could paint underneath that. So you could actually do the entire thing by hand. It would be very time consuming. And in the very earliest iterations of Maya, the tools were so primitive that you spent a lot of time just manually coming and unfolding. And there will be instances when the unfold doesn't give you the exact result you want, or you unfold and there's still a little bit of overlap in there. And you'll have to zoom in and just manually unfold the UVs. That means that there's no overlap. So this is, I think if we were just trying to create a default UV map for this insect, this would be a good all-around solution. But let's look at some other techniques as we build this from scratch. To review, I've got my joints. They're created, but I have them hidden. This isn't bound. I believe I deleted the history, but let's just for good measure say delete all by type history. This is in the 1 mode, right? I can see in the 3 mode what it will look like when it's smooth, but I'm not working with the smooth version. I'm working with my first iteration, which will make this a little bit more straightforward. And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to do 1/2. So I'm going to right click and choose face. I'm going to hide my joints in this view. I were to draw a bounding box, I would select the joints. So we will draw that right to the edge and hit delete. Probably a good idea just to come and take a close look, make sure that you didn't go over or miss something. And that looks like a clean half selection. And right, this one already has the UV map. So when you open yours, if you haven't created the UV map yet, oh, that looks like I had those laid out backwards. I had the wrong side laid out. In that case, let me just demonstrate that real quick. This would be an example of when we wanted to use the flip. On the U. Right, so that should have been over there. When I laid that out, I didn't realize that. But when we deleted one half, we saw that, right? And that's what the flip gives us. We needed to have that on the right side. But we're doing away with this one. And just to get us started, we're going to say UV planar. And majority of the time, planar just gives you a great starting point. Before I even do that, let me mention sometimes students anticipate that they'll just be able to hit automatic. And automatic typically does not work on the overall model. You can pick pieces of a model and use automatic to good results sometimes. But even a model like this in the base mesh, it's not guessing correctly, right? This would not give us a good result to paint. So a lot of students anticipate that automatic will do all the work for them. Automatic works more just on a portion. Someday I think as the algorithms get better and better, the programming gets better and better, you will, and over the years we've seen the unfold tool get better and better. But we're going to start a lot of the time just with a planar projection. That's just going to create a two-dimensional map, and we'd want to project down on the Y, right? So I went UV planar dialog box, chose Y, and I'll hit project. And you can see, we can see half that model. And now we'll begin the process of cutting and unfolding. Let's start with the wing. Now in the previous version I left those two together, but let's talk about how we would lay something out flat. Let's imagine that we weren't going to project straight through. So I want to do this version slightly differently to show you some examples of some techniques or concepts. I want to get the edge, and here's a very common mistake. I'll double click this edge, and we kind of think that looks like it might be a loop, right, that's going all around. The other thing when we're working with edges, I'm going to hit the F key just so that centers there, and I can dolly around. And what we'll discover is it actually, because it came to this intersection, it couldn't go all the way around as a loop. So often a student will double click, imagine that they have the total, and then they'll come to cut, and you even see that it gives you this edge. But when we go to separate it, it's still a single piece. It's as if we'd used a cookie cutter that wasn't completely closed, right? We can't, you need a closed cookie cutter to be able to pull that piece of dough out. We didn't get all the way around. So beware when you double click. If you don't have a clean loop, you'll have to just come and manually select. So I'm going to shift select that additional edge. The 4 keys also helpful, right? If we did that here, if we double clicked, you can visually see, that didn't go around, and then we can shift select that one. So I have a closed loop, and now when I come to cut, and we right click and choose shell, and I pick that, and with my move tool I can move that around. Now that's cutting the piece aside. The secondary reason that we'll use cut is to create a seam so that something can be laid out. If I just hit unfold right here, it really it couldn't guess properly how that might be laid out. So I'll hit undo, and in this case we're going to cut without a closed loop. So I'm going to, let's imagine on the back bottom, right? We're always looking for the least conspicuous place to cut. So I'm going to grab that edge, and yeah, there's lots of seams here, so I'm going to manually just shift select this edge all the way around. Maybe the 5 is easier to see. Shift select, shift select, shift select, shift select, shift select, And that would be a good place. So it's not a closed loop in this case because we're not completely separating it. We're cutting the edge in this instance, right? It's not going all the way around. It's just along that soon to be seam, and I'll hit cut. And now the algorithm of unfold will know where the border should be. So we'll select that and now hit unfold. And you see that it laid it out flat. And if we wanted to paint across the wing, let's say we wanted a different top from the bottom, this would be how we would execute it. And we'll just scale that. And we'll use this version forward. I'll show you I can quickly get back as well at the end. So we've got that cut off. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do single seam legs. So what I want to do is cut off the legs, or separate the legs, I should say. Oops, sorry. I'll come and I'll hit the F key, right, just to center that. I got off center. Also, the Q or select tool makes this a little bit easier. And I'm just going to create a closed loop, right, because we're cutting this off completely. And we'll come and we'll hit cut. And if that was indeed closed, right, I can come and pick the shell and then move that over, move that off, right? Now let's cut each of those legs individually. If you wanted to work on the body, you could, having separated that. But let me just finish the thought on the legs. So I'll just pick those two edges. That's the only place where that connection is, and I'll hit cut. And now we should see, yeah, that they're separate. And what I want to do, I mentioned on the previous version we had a double seamed leg because we were thinking top and bottom. Here we've got the legs completely separate. We'll create a single seam and then we'll unfold those. And we want to think in terms of least conspicuous. So I would say probably this edge. I'll double click and that comes all the way to this intersection. So I did have the ability to double click. Now, let me, as an aside here, when we're we've separated our shells. We have some separate shells. And I double click that edge and it gave me the long piece here. If my move tool or any of my transform tools weren't sitting right on the edge, if this was kind of over here a little bit, that would mean that I also had an edge on this other piece. And when I went to hit cut, I'd get it cut where I wanted, but I'd also have some cuts on the other shell. And in this case, remember that control will allow you to deselect. So a lot of times if this isn't right on the edge, you might have to come and, if you can see it, you could deselect it, but just drawing a bounding box, I'm holding the option key. That would deselect anything there and deselect anything there. And then you should see your transform tool snap back to where the edge is. If we come across that, that may have seemed a little abstract. If we come across that, I'll re-demonstrate it. But just note, you want to have your transform tool right on the edge that's selected. If it's somewhere out here or out here, that would mean that we've also got an edge selected on these, and just an option bounding box would make sure that you deselected those edges. And we can do this all at once. Let's just do this at once. I'll shift there. And then on our back leg, right, maybe the inconspicuous would be here, right? So if we kind of zoom in, I've got the rear bottom edge, and then I've got the front edge because we might have a camera view of this leg from behind. And we can do this all at once. I'll hit cut. And then why did we want to cut that? So now when we hit unfold, that unfolds predictably. And we can just use our rotate tool and kind of just straighten those up, and we don't want them overlapping. There are some automatic features for laying things out and making sure everything conforms, and we'll talk about those towards the end. But I'm just manually using my transform tools to place these. And so right here is our leg, and it's a single seam, right? So we can paint all along that, and we've strategically placed that seam in the least conspicuous part of the model. So this is a single seam versus that initial UV map that we looked at was a double seam. Now let's think about the head, or yeah, we could think about the whole body. Let's handle the head separately, and then we'll talk about reattaching. So I'm going to grab this. Again, I got kind of out of sorts here. I can just pick something, hit F to kind of get in there and recenter. I'm going to double click that, and we can see that that goes all the way around. There's nothing there for it to be mistaken. So that's a good selection. We'll hit cut. And then, right, if I pulled this out, and if we were to hit unfold, that's actually not bad. So we just cut that off and then hit unfold. And you could leave the eye there. The eye is an important part, and being able to lay that down flat, we might also want to cut this apart. And it's already laid out there. You could hit unfold and smooth that a little bit. Now, it can be confusing when you look at, right, we know that this roughly corresponds, but just pick some faces. So I can pick some faces there and say, okay, there is the antenna, and there is the mandible. So I actually would want this kind of rolled up that way, right? And we'll kind of straighten that out and move that over. Now for the body, yeah, let's use that same technique. We'll cut this off, double click, hit the F key, and I can see that that goes all the way around. We can hit cut. I can grab this and hit unfold. And again, we can kind of tell the top because of those three edges, right? We imagine that there's some kind of ridge on that. So this would, I'm using the minus key to make my transform tool a little bit smaller. Just a reminder, plus and minus will change the size. And so that's how we'll stitch that together. And then last but not least, and we don't have to make any cuts, we'll just hit unfold. And that looks like the wing would be on the top there. Now, let's reattach these. So, right, we've laid them out, and I'm grabbing these edges, and you can see that they share, right? They are the same edge. Also, just in terms of the overlapping, this isn't overlapping, but if this was something important to paint, we'd want to relax that. But I'll grab, I don't want to double click, it'll go all the way around. I could click this edge, double click this edge, and as long as there's fewer than the other way, it will select in between. Right? If I just double click, it goes all the way around. But I could double click that way, or you can manually select. And then I'll hit stitch together. So this is a tool we haven't used yet. We cut these apart so that we can lay them out flat, and then we'll hit stitch. Now we're getting some overlap there, and right, this is an example of where you could come in, and if it's simple enough, right, to manually move that. You can also pick those UVs, and we've been using unfold on the entire shell, but you can selectively, you can select specific UVs and hit unfold, and that actually didn't give us the result we were after. So here's an example of when, right, we're just gonna very quickly unfold those UVs. We could take a look at what an overall unfold would look like, but we'll probably do that towards the end. And yeah, that looked like it would have corrected it too. I'll go ahead and just leave that there for now. And let's move this over, and we'll take a look here. So this edge corresponds, edge, edge, edge. Now, if I had picked this edge and this edge highlighted, then that would mean that one was flipped, and we'd have to pick whichever one was facing the wrong direction and use our flip, right? But when I pick this edge and it automatically highlights there, I know that they're both facing the same direction. And we'll use our little technique, double click, and then I'll hit stitch together. Let me hit undo. So gives you additional space. Stitch together moves them together. So if you were to hit stitch together and there was lots of overlap, you could undo and probably go with sew. Right up here when we stitched it together, we had some overlap. Sew might have been the better option because at the very end we're going to unfold it. So subtle difference there. I'm using stitch together, but you can experiment with sew as you work. And so there we go. That is our UV map. And then now all we have to do is, right, we're coming back, and let me just reiterate, we're looking at the shells, right? When we cut the edges, we're cutting this imaginary UV shell, all right? It's a shell of the surface. But we didn't make any cuts to our model, right? It's still just bug UV, no history, and I've got leg 5 on there for some reason. So, right, this is continuous, and we'll mirror this over. So we know that mesh mirror will open the dialog box. This would be on Y, or excuse me, across the X, and it's currently sitting in positive X, so we would push it in negative, which is the default. And then I'm going to come and just out of habit, 0.1, and you want to check at this point. Everything should have been on that edge. Let me actually undo that and talk about something fairly common. If I double click, if I had some not UVs, now we're talking about vertexes. If I had some vertexes that were slightly over or one way or the other, right, you can double click that edge and then scale those together, and that'll give you back that straight line. And then if it's off from this center line, you could use the move tool, right? Click just the arrow, which is limiting us on that axis. And then you can hold down the X key and click, and it would snap everything right to that line. So before you mirror, you want to make sure that you don't have UV. Oh, I said UVs again. That you don't have vertexes over the center line or short of the center line, because then you'll either have a gap and you'll have to change that number. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's just better to have a very straight edge. So I'm going to say now mirror, and again 0.1 should be all you need to do for those vertexes to become a continuous surface. And so if we look at our UV, you say, oh, where is it? Well, we've doubled everything and they're sitting in the same place. Now in that first example, having the wings sitting in the same place was what we wanted. But in this example, I've unfolded the wings, and certainly with the body and legs, we want to get them onto the other side. And this is a little bit of an example. Right when I started and deleted one half, I realized I had placed, I forget which one it was, but I had placed something on the wrong side. So the way to figure that out is you can just pick a shell. So I can come and if I pick the shell out here, I can see this is the one that should be over here. And now I see that I would want to have it flipped, right, so that it's kind of corresponding that way. I can pick the shell, right, a UV shell, pick it out here, and then I know that I'm picking the one on the left side, or in this case, the negative X side. And then we'll hit flip. Right, we'll grab the eye on that side, and we know that that should be over there. I'll grab my 3 legs, and we'll put them over here, and I know that I need to flip those. And the only thing I want to stitch now is this body. So let's move these out of the way. We're eventually going to put everything back in this X square, but we're kind of working just all over the place here. There we go. So let me undo back. We want to start there, right, just short of that intersection, and we'll come below the mouth. So double clicking, we've got it just on that side. We'll hit stitch together and select that and unfold, and there we have it. So there is one version, right? We're going to have seams where the body hits the legs, but we have to have seams somewhere, and depending on what the model is, right? Insects, maybe we just paint that black. And in terms of making intersections work, you can just use the same exact color to paint. And if you're strategic, no one will see the seam, even if it's in a pretty conspicuous place. So our legs come here, and we can just grab all of the shells and modify, normalize. And I'm going to open the dialog box, and I have preserve aspect ratio on, and then we'll click it, and they all kind of fit there. And in fact, let's give ourselves a little bit better layout. Put this here. The other thing, the eye is so different on the insect. I'm actually going to make these a little bit larger. When we get over to Photoshop, I will demonstrate how we can create a pattern hexagon shape and use that for the color channel, the specular channel, and the bump map to create a really interesting eye. So we'll just make that a little bit larger. And then I'll use my normalize again. And so that fits there. Now these legs are a little bit close to that edge, so we'll just leave that. So you can go back and compare this one, right? We've got our wing, and in fact, you know, that would probably be better if we scale that a little bit proportionately. And yeah. Okay. So we don't want them too close. I think I got it too big now. Because when we're painting and cutting, let's say in Photoshop, it makes it easier if they're not so close that we can't use a bounding box selection, or that we have to be too careful when we're selecting. So there we go. It's a different map than the one we started with, but in this case we have a single seam on our leg. We have that same continuous body, but the seam here is along the belly of the insect. We've got our eyes maybe a little bit too big, and then we've unfolded the wings, which gives us a separate top and bottom. And then let's export our UV map. The one thing to note when you're exporting, it has to be selected in object mode. So, and this little icon here, oops, nope, this one here, the camera. So the little camera here will open your UV snapshot. You could also go, the long way is image UV snapshot, or click that little camera. Your size, right? We want to potentially make some poster-sized versions of these, so having a real large UV resolution would be important. We could crank that all the way up, depending on how much RAM you have and how much experience you have in Photoshop. Image format JPEG, and then you want to just tell it where it's going to save to, the source images of your default folder. If you're working in your default folder, you'd want to save this UV map to the source images and just work in the source images folder. And then you hit OK, and that will export, and you can open that in Photoshop. And I'm going to go over bringing this UV map into Photoshop in another video. But that wraps up this video and how we would lay out a UV map for our insect. And just a quick review, we used cut to cut edges. We use stitch together. I think in an instance or two I used sew. We used unfold. We made sure that we had the unfold 3D plugin, and we also used flip UV. Those were the only 4 tools that we used to be able to create this effective UV map. Okay, questions in the tech discussion forum. Have a good one.